the launch of the British Podcast Awards, podcasting challenges in China, and helping your podcast stand out.
Welcome to the Richard Daly Podcast, bringing you a UK perspective on the latest news and developments from the world of podcasting and internet radio.
Welcome to episode 24. I'm your host, Richard Daly. Each week I curate and discuss the latest news in podcasting and internet radio with a focus on the smaller podcaster, radio host and DJ. Now, there have been podcast awards around since about 2005, though these have mostly been US-centric. In 2015, the UK's first podcast awards were presented by UK podcasters at their conference, New Media Europe. But for 2017, we now have a new set of British Podcast Awards that have been launched by Matt Deegan and Matt Hill. Both Matts have been involved in podcasting for several years. Matt Hill makes podcasts for Private Eye, The Week and Broadcast Magazine, as well as producing podcasts such as Spark True Stories, The Modern Man, and for Formula One's sake through his company Rethink Audio. Matt Deegan organises the next radio conference in London with James Cridland and created the first podcast network for UK radio whilst working for GCAP Media. Deegan is also the creative director of the radio and new media firm Folder Media and runs a children's radio station called Fun Kids. They say that the aim of the awards is to discover the breakout hits that rival the most talked about shows of recent years. The chair of judges for 2017 will be Helen Zaltzman. Helen co-hosts the podcast Answer Me This, which is probably one of the UK's most successful and longest running podcasts. There will be awards in 15 categories, including sport, comedy, current affairs and true crime. There's also a category called Best Radio Podcast and a few other special categories as well. The winners will be announced at the end of April at a gala event and post-show party. The awards are being sponsored by Audio Boom, as well as the recording studio Maple Street Studios and UK Radio Player. The finalists will also be featured in an exclusive podcast series, which will be available through The Guardian's website. Entries for the awards opened on the 6th of February and they close on Monday the 6th of March. To enter your podcast, you need to visit BritishPodcastAwards.com. It will cost you £15.53 to enter your podcast into the awards. So what podcasts are likely to feature in these awards? Well, I think we got some insight into this when Matt Hill was interviewed on the Radio Today podcast by Trevor Dan this week. Matt said that the awards will celebrate the high-quality podcasts being produced in the UK and stop the UK industry being sidelined by the dominance of the US. Now, the language is all about radio and big media as far as I can see, and I'm sure the awards will be dominated by content from radio stations, the BBC and media organisations like The Guardian. But it will be interesting to see if any of the great independent podcasters out there can break through and pick up some of these awards from the big guys. James Cridland highlights an interesting article in his newsletter this week asking why podcasting in China seems to have only a limited appeal. Written by Martin Millett for a website that serves the Chinese community in the US, as well as the rest of the world, called Yabada. This piece actually cites another article that looks at the reasons why podcasting has struggled in China. The article is from a website called Sixth Tone, which is part of the Chinese state-funded Shanghai United Media Group. So the basic question is, why is it that in a country that's 560 million smartphone users, podcasting has failed to break through? The article notes that about 72 million people, that's about 5% of the Chinese population, listen to podcasts. In the US, that percentage is now over 20. Basically, it seems that lifestyle distinctions over Western countries are the main reason for podcasting's limited appeal amongst Chinese users. Public transportation for commuters is much more prevalent in China, so commuters can use other kinds of digital content on the go, especially videos, which is pretty difficult to do if you're driving. iTunes has only been available in China since 2009. That's 4 years later than most other countries had access to it. Finally, censorship is seen as an issue in China. In the West, there are lots of podcasts that tackle controversial or sensitive subjects, but few podcasts of this nature are being created in China, perhaps because podcast producers there feel they need to be more careful. Now, interestingly, audiobooks are quite popular in China, with a higher percentage of Chinese listening to these than Americans. The article puts this down to an issue of liability, as words that come from written works rather than original spoken content are easier to police. China's largest providers of audio content may have embraced audiobooks just because of that. Of course, it's not just China where this question of liability and of censorship is currently being debated. There have been recent articles covering this topic on Iran and Vietnam, to name just two. Personally, I think what we will see is producers outside of these countries making content aimed at them. On the Rain News blog this week, Brad Hill looks at iHeartRadio's 2017 focus on podcasting. iHeartRadio is apparently building up its podcasting capabilities with new content, technology partnerships and in-house leadership. Brad notes that the first step in establishing this focus was when they hired Chris Peterson as Senior Vice President of Podcasting in November last year. Peterson joined iHeartRadio from TuneIn, where he was their Content Partnership Manager. On the technical side, iHeartRadio has announced an integration of Art19's API, which should mean that podcast publishers which distribute on iHeartRadio get better data about audience consumption when people listen on iHeart's platform. That, of course, is part of the debate between streaming and downloading. iHeartRadio has been accumulating content and building other business relationships in the industry with companies such as WNYC, Panoply, Audioboom and PRX. They've also been making their own original content. Tagline is a conversational podcast about advertising, creativity and culture that has been made in conjunction with Ad Age. The first episode of Tagline has just been published. iHeart also plans to take advantage of the presenter talent and production assets of their 850 radio stations to launch further original podcasts. Brad concludes his article by saying that iHeart Media seems determined to gain a leadership position in podcasting to match the consumer recognition that it has in streaming radio. Some brief news from Spreaker now have announced that they're changing the way they count podcast downloads. Spreaker will now be using the recently published IAB guidelines to determine what constitutes a download. If your podcast is on Spreaker, then it's definitely worth reading their listener analytics document, which provides more details about how downloads and plays are counted. You'll find a link to the document in the show notes for this episode at richarddalley.com/24. The document discusses how this data is processed in order to better represent actual user behaviour and to avoid fraudulent and fake traffic being counted. Spreaker believe that they're in a unique position to do this because they're able to control their platform from end to end. Because they control everything, Spreaker can see where media file requests to their platform come from and can use this to calculate downloads more accurately. I've discussed the effectiveness of brand advertising in podcasts on the last couple of episodes, and this week Podcast One announced that they've just completed a research project with Edison Research. This project was designed specifically to measure the effectiveness of brand advertising in podcasts, and it looked at product awareness, perception, whether commercials in podcasts increase how aware listeners are of the sponsor, how favourably listeners view the sponsor, and how inclined they are to buy the sponsor's product after hearing an advert. I'll run through some of the findings of the research. More than 60% of listeners mentioned a specific grocery brand post-campaign, compared to just 7% in the pre-study. Unaided product awareness grew from the pre-study to the post-study by 47% for a financial services product, by 37% for an automobile aftermarket product, and by 24% for a lawn and garden product. In the post-study, over one-third of respondents had a very favourable opinion of an automobile aftermarket product, up from 18% in pre-study. In the post-study, 22% said they were very likely to consider using a lawn and garden product, up from 16% in the pre-study. Awareness of a specific campaign message for an automobile aftermarket product increased by 60% from the pre-study to the post-study, and for a casual dining restaurant by 76%. Podcast One conclude that the research shows the significant positive impact of podcast advertising on brand recall, intent to purchase, and the recall of specific messaging, and these are certainly compelling findings. I guess the gap here is that we don't know which podcasts were included in the research, and I do wonder how much that might have impacted the results. There is also the question of how much impact each advert has. I mean that a well-produced and memorable ad is going to be more effective than one that is not so well done. Mark Ramsey has written an interesting article for his blog this week entitled Radio's Lost Podcasting Opportunity. It is a fairly short piece, but it's well worth a read. As always, I'll put a link in the show notes at richarddalley.com/24. Basically, in the article, Mark is saying that there is a lot of great podcast content out there, and that radio stations have an opportunity to license some of that content for broadcasting. He notes that when podcasters have reached out to radio stations with this idea, they've often been rebuffed because the stations just can't seem to fit it into their schedules. Many people think that speech content, at least in the American market, other than sports or news, belongs only on AM, and weekly shows can only be run on weekends. The problem then is that those AM radio stations don't have big enough audiences to justify spending money on content. Mark believes that radio stations should be happy to take ready-made quality content that has a track record at generating audiences and broadcast it on their platform, as this could benefit those stations by giving the audience more unique and compelling programming, which will then create larger and more easily monetised audiences. Mark then goes on to note that there's very little on most music stations after 10 p.m. that is better, more compelling or more attractive than a great podcast. This, of course, is very apt with the current trend in the UK to cut live overnight DJs and replace them with voice-tracked music lists. Yes, I'm looking at you, BBC Radio 2. Next, a really useful piece of how-to content on podcasting by Jay Acunzo for the Content Marketing Institute. It's called 3 Hidden Lessons Behind Top Podcasts to Help Yours Stand Out. Now, this is a really in-depth article which has the premise that the personal and casual feel of many podcasts belies their true nature, that a great show is incredibly hard to create. It's easy to start a podcast, but even some huge brands have failed in their attempts to build a quality, sustainable show. The article takes a look at what makes some shows great and delves deep into the planning and production workflows they use to achieve this. While there's virtually no barrier to entry to create and share a show, there's tremendous friction in making that show great. Jay breaks the article down into a number of lessons and provides good example podcasts for each one. Lesson 1 is that, at first, format trumps talent. This is about having a plan for your show that keeps the format consistent. This planning also improves both efficiency and quality and can help you keep producing episodes when other things get in the way. The example podcast that Jay uses for this lesson is The Full Monty from Scott Monty, the CEO of Brain and Trust Partners. Joe notes that this podcast has a really tight format that helps Scott produce episodes with minimal time and budget while still delivering a really great product to his listeners. The podcast is broken down into time blocks which stay consistent across each episode. You can read the full article to see the detailed breakdown of the time slots and listen to the episode. Link in the show notes, richarddalley.com/24. Lesson 2 is time constraints are your strength. Perhaps a little more controversial this one, as Jay asks, is a 60-minute episode really necessary to deliver the most value? Jay definitely thinks not, and I tend to agree with him. In fact, I discussed my own thoughts on this in episode 23. The example used for this lesson is The Way I Heard It from Mike Rowe. Mike's target length for each episode is 10 minutes. Now, his background is in television, where time constraints are routine, and he tries to maximise every second of the show. Mike is also, like most of us, a busy man with lots of projects on the go, and the 10-minute format allows him to record multiple episodes at the same time, something that's hard to do with 60-minute shows. Lesson 3 is to create recurring segments or content brands within the show. This is a great way to see what works and what doesn't. You can see what your audience likes and continue to use that type of content while dropping those they don't like. Reply All from Gimlet Media is the example used here. Jay notes that over the time Reply All has been running, the hosts have established several different content brands within their show. Finally, Jay provides a really useful bonus for podcast producers. This is the actual Trello board that Jay uses to outline the editorial pipeline of a story-driven podcast that he produces called Unthinkable. If you're not familiar with it, Trello is a software tool that organises your projects into visual boards, mimicking post-it notes. It's designed to help planning and collaboration. At one glance, Trello can tell you what's been worked on, who's working on what, and where they're working on it. Jay says readers of his article should feel free to borrow, adapt, or outright steal from this. Okay, so that's all the news from the Richard Daly podcast for this week. If you visit my website at richarddalley.com, you'll find all my social media links, as well as the various ways you can subscribe to the show. The show notes for this episode are at richarddalley.com/24. As usual, please send me your questions or comments, and if there is a topic you'd like me to cover, then you can tweet me. As always, I really appreciate your feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd be really delighted if you'd leave me a rating and review at iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.